In the summer of 1940, the German High Command, especially the leadership of Air Force and the strategists linked to Hermann Göring, he believed that British morale would collapse under continuous bombardment. The logic was simple: destroy cities, disrupt sleep, spread constant fear, and thereby weaken the soldiers even before facing them on the battlefield. What they expected was clear: exhausted, insecure, emotionally broken soldiers. What they found was something else entirely. During the Blitz, between September 1940 and May 1941, British soldiers, they continued reporting for duty after entire nights under attack. Battered barracks were reorganized. Displaced units were back in operation within hours. There were no waves of desertion, no disciplinary collapse, no mass breakdown of military morale. This is not rhetoric. It is what the German reports themselves recorded with growing frustration. This video will show why Göring and the Luftwaffe command made a mistake. The story explores why people thought bombs would replace occupation, and why the British soldier, ordinary, tired, human, simply didn't react as expected. Not out of bravado, not for propaganda, but due to much more practical and difficult-to-destroy factors. And that's exactly where the story gets interesting. If nightly bombings weren't enough to break the morale of British soldiers, what truly kept these men standing when everything around them seemed to be collapsing? That's what you'll discover here. If this kind of real, straightforward, and unromanticized story captivates you, this is the type of content this channel delivers. By subscribing and liking, you help these stories continue to be told the right way. And tell me something in the comments. What city are you watching from right now? The war was global, and those watching today are also part of that history. When the Blitz began, it wasn't an improvised attack or a fit of rage. There was calculation, there were meetings, maps laid out on tables, reports read coldly. The objective of the German High Command wasn't just to destroy factories or strike isolated military targets. The main goal was to break the British psyche, and along with it, the morale of the soldiers who sustained the entire defense of the country. The idea was simple and dangerous. If fear was constant, if rest disappeared, if the feeling of security was ripped away night after night, the British soldier would begin to fail internally even before failing on the battlefield. German logic stemmed from a clear conviction. They believed that a soldier fights not only with weapons, but with his mind. If the mind gives way, the body follows. By bombing London, Liverpool, Coventry, and other cities, the plan was to create an environment of continuous exhaustion. It wasn't just about destroying buildings, it was about depriving people of sleep, creating permanent anxiety, spreading the feeling that no one was safe, not even far from the front lines. The British soldier should wake up knowing that his family could have been hit during the night. This, in the German view, would weaken the sense of military duty. This plan was directly linked to Germany's inability to defeat the Royal Air Force in the skies during the Battle of Britain. When it became clear that air superiority wouldn't come quickly, the strategy changed. The Blitz emerged as an alternative. If they couldn't defeat the Air Force, perhaps they could defeat the nation's mind. The leadership of Air Force. He went on to argue that mass attacks against urban areas would cause panic, political pressure, and consequently military disorganization. The mistake started right there. The Germans conflated two different targets as if they were one. They treated civilians and soldiers as if they reacted the same way to fear. They assumed that the psychological impact on the cities would automatically translate into collapse within the barracks. But the British soldier wasn't just living as a civilian under attack. He was already immersed in a logic of total war. The sound of bombs wasn't an unexpected shock. It was part of a conflict he knew he had to go through. Furthermore, the Blitz was designed to be quick and decisive. There was no intention of sustaining months of bombing without concrete results. The expectation was that after a few weeks, the accumulated psychological effect would generate enough pressure to force political concessions or, at the very least, drastically reduce British military efficiency. When this did not happen, the plan began to show cracks. The bombs continued to fall, but the expected effect simply did not materialize. British soldiers witnessed the destruction, heard reports, felt the impact, but they also perceived something fundamental. Despite everything, the country continued to function. Orders continued to be given. Units did not disband. Discipline remained. The German objective of generating absolute mental chaos was not being achieved as imagined, and this created a silent contradiction. The longer the Blitz lasted, the more evident it became that the psychological strategy was failing. Ultimately, the Blitz stemmed from a misinterpretation of how military morale behaves under direct attack. Germany gambled that constant fear would break the will to fight. It failed to understand that for many British soldiers, that same fear reinforced the notion that there was no alternative but to resist. This difference between expectation and reality didn't appear all at once. It revealed itself gradually, night after night, report after report. And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to change direction, because what should have weakened them ended up producing the opposite effect, and the signs of this were already emerging long before the Germans realized it. The second mistake was deeper, more silent, and ultimately more decisive. Germany did not understand the British mentality. He didn't understand how that soldier thought, where his emotional resilience came from, nor how he reacted when pushed to the limit. The German command analyzed numbers, infrastructure, urban density, but failed to interpret the human factor. They believed the British would react as other peoples had reacted to swift and devastating attacks. This assumption proved costly. For German strategists, continuous bombing was supposed to produce progressive emotional collapse. First fear, then exhaustion, then apathy, and finally breakdown. It was a logical sequence on paper, but the British soldier didn't experience the Blitz as an isolated event. He placed it within a larger story, a line of continuity. There was a very clear understanding that this wasn't the end of the world, but a phase of the war. Hard, brutal, but surmountable. This completely changes how fear is processed. The average Briton wasn't raised to expect comfort in difficult times. From an early age, there was a culture of emotional restraint, of carrying on even when conditions weren't ideal. It wasn't theatrical heroism, it was habit. The soldier didn't need to believe he would win every day. He only needed to accomplish what was in front of him at that moment, and that in itself neutralized a good part of the psychological effect that the Blitz intended to cause. Another overlooked point was the soldier's relationship with authority. Germany imagined that, under extreme pressure, distrust in leadership, internal questioning, and noise in the chain of command would arise. The opposite happened. The clarity of orders, the predictability of routines, and the feeling that the command did not hide the gravity of the situation generated trust. The soldier was not treated as someone who needed to be deceived to continue fighting. He knew the situation was serious, and precisely for that reason, he took his role seriously. There is also a detail that is often forgotten. The Blitz was not experienced as a distant attack. Many soldiers were on leave, in training, or stationed near the bombed areas. They saw the destruction with their own eyes, but they also saw something equally important. People continued to live. Trains started running again. Makeshift barracks sprang up. Basic functions were quickly restored. This created a concrete perception of resilience, not based on speeches, but on observable facts in everyday life. The Germans expected widespread panic. What they found was adaptation. Sirens became part of the routine. Shelters ceased to be a novelty. The initial shock gave way to more practical behavior. For the soldier, this meant less surprise and less of a feeling of being out of control. When the unexpected becomes expected, the psychological impact decreases drastically. This is a basic point of human psychology that has been underestimated. Furthermore, Germany projected its own fears onto the enemy. It imagined how it would react if its own cities were bombed in that way, and concluded that collapse would be inevitable. But each society reacts differently to pressure. The British soldier did not interpret the Blitz as proof of his country's weakness, but as confirmation that the enemy needed to resort to this type of attack because it was unable to win in any other way. This interpretation changes everything. Gradually, a silent realization began to emerge among the troops. If after weeks of bombing the country was still standing, then perhaps Germany lacked the capacity to break. This idea wasn't spoken aloud, but it was felt. And when that feeling takes hold, fear loses some of its control. Germany didn't realize this in time. It continued to insist on a strategy based on a misinterpretation of human behavior. And while it persisted, something was strengthening on the other side, something that didn't appear on maps or in damage reports, but that was beginning to become decisive for everything that would follow. There is one point that almost never appears in military reports, but which weighed heavily on the minds of British soldiers every day during the Blitz, the memory of the First World War, not as a history book, but as something alive, present within the home. Many of those men grew up hearing stories from their fathers, uncles, and grandfathers who had spent years in the trenches of France. Stories of mud, cold, hunger, endless waiting, and silent death. Compared to that, the Blitz was terrible, but it was not unknown. This made a huge difference. The British soldier of 1940 didn't go into war thinking it would be short, clean, or controllable. He already knew that real wars are long, messy, and exhausting. There was no illusion to shatter. When the bombs started falling, there wasn't that psychological shock of believing you're safe and suddenly discovering you're not. Many had grown up with the idea that, in critical moments, the country would demand total sacrifice. The Blitz didn't create this mentality. It only activated it. This factor completely changes how fear works. The fear that destroys is the one that catches a person unprepared, that shatters expectations. The fear that is anticipated, that has already been imagined, tends to be more controllable. The British soldier didn't ask himself, how is this possible, but how long will this last? And this question, although harsh, is much less paralyzing. It presupposes continuity, not collapse. There was also a constant, albeit silent, sense of comparison. Many soldiers knew that their families had endured years of artillery bombardment, weeks trapped in trenches under continuous fire, entire offensives advancing meters at the cost of thousands of lives. This created a powerful psychological reference point. It wasn't empty pride, it was a clear line of thought. If they endured that, we can endure this, not as bravado, but as emotional logic. Another important detail is that the First World War taught the British Army something essential. Resistance is not enthusiasm. It is not expected that a soldier will be motivated every day. He is expected to continue even when motivation fades. This distinction is crucial. Germany gambled that emotional exhaustion would cause morale to disappear. It failed to realize that the British system already operated on the idea that morale fluctuates, but duty remains. When the Blitz attempted to attack morale, it encountered a mental structure that did not depend on it. This legacy also shaped how soldiers dealt with loss. Death, destruction, and bad news were not entirely new. They were tragedies, yes, but understood within a larger context. The Blitz was not seen as something unprecedented, but as another chapter in a war that would require prolonged resistance. This drastically reduces the demoralizing potential of continuous attacks. While the Germans believed they were creating something unbearable, many British soldiers saw the Blitz as a harsh but temporary ordeal. They didn't know when it would end, but they knew it wasn't eternal. This perception changes everything, because when suffering has meaning, even if distant, it ceases to be merely destructive. It becomes something to be overcome. And as the days passed and the country continued to function, this collective memory gained strength. It wasn't something celebrated or romanticized. It was accepted. And this silent acceptance, inherited from a previous war still fresh in everyone's memory, began to create a much more solid psychological foundation than Germany had imagined. A foundation that made no noise, but that would support even more difficult decisions when the pressure increased in the following months. There was also something very simple, and at the same time very powerful, guiding the British soldier during the Blitz. He knew exactly what was at stake. It wasn't an abstract idea, it wasn't vague propaganda, it wasn't distant rhetoric. It was concrete. It was the very existence of the country as he knew it. The soldier didn't fight merely on orders or out of military discipline. He fought because he understood in a practical way what it would mean to lose. When the bombs began to fall on British cities, there was no confusion about the reason for the war. There was no doubt about who was attacking and why. The soldier didn't need convincing that this was serious. He saw destroyed houses, battered ports, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. This made it clear that this was not a limited or negotiable dispute. It was a direct attempt to break the country from within, and this clarity, paradoxically, strengthened rather than weakened. For many soldiers, the Blitz shattered any remaining illusions. There was no longer room for thinking about easy solutions or quick deals. The attack on the cities showed that the war would not be decided solely between armies, but between ways of life. This made the choice very simple, albeit difficult: resist or accept a future imposed by force. When the decision is so clear, fear loses some of its paralyzing power. Another key point is that the British soldier didn't feel like he was fighting for something distant. The line between the front and the rear practically disappeared. The war was at home, in familiar streets, in the places where he grew up or where his family lived. This created a direct connection between military service and civilian life. Duty ceased to be abstract. Each night of bombing reinforced the notion that retreating wouldn't protect anyone. It would only leave everything more vulnerable. This understanding also affected how the soldier interpreted suffering. Pain, fatigue, and fear were not seen as signs of failure, but as an inevitable part of something greater. There was no expectation of comfort. There was an expectation of resistance. The Blitz did not destroy this mentality because it was already formed before the first bomb fell. When the attack began, it only confirmed what many already knew. This would be a long war, and only those who accepted this would be able to get through it. Furthermore, there was a profound sense of collective responsibility. The soldier knew that his demeanor influenced not only his unit, but also the morale of those at home. Demonstrating firmness, obeying orders, maintaining military routine, all of this had enormous symbolic weight. It wasn't theatrics, it was an awareness that any sign of weakness could spread rapidly. This perception made self-control almost automatic, even in extreme situations. The Germans hoped the Blitz would create despair and questioning. What it created was silent determination, because when the enemy's objective becomes too obvious, the margin for doubt disappears. The British soldier didn't need to be reminded why he was there. He heard it every night in the sound of sirens and explosions, and each attack reinforced the same conclusion. There was no viable alternative but to continue. Over time, this understanding transformed into something even more solid. It wasn't optimism, nor blind confidence in immediate victory. It was commitment, a cold, practical, almost stubborn commitment. And it is precisely this type of commitment that psychological warfare has the most difficulty breaking, because it doesn't depend on heightened emotion, but on clear conviction. And the further the Blitz progressed, the more this conviction took root, preparing the ground for something the Germans definitely didn't expect to encounter in the later stages of the war. Another decisive factor, often underestimated, was the way the British leadership communicated with its soldiers during the Blitz. There was no attempt to soften the blow. There were no empty promises that everything would end quickly. The British soldier was not treated as someone who needed to be deceived into continuing to obey orders, and that made all the difference. The central figure in this was Winston Churchill, not as a distant symbol, but as a constant presence in the way war was explained. Churchill didn't speak like someone trying to calm a child. He spoke like someone who knew exactly the magnitude of the problem and didn't hide it. When he said that difficult times were coming, the soldier believed him because it matched what he saw in practice. When he affirmed that the country would resist, this resistance wasn't wrapped in empty optimism, but in recognition of the necessary sacrifice. This creates something rare in times of war: trust. British soldiers quickly recognized when a leader was lying, and during the Blitz there was no room for lies to last long. If the leadership said the situation was under control while cities were being bombed night after night, that disconnect would destroy morale in weeks. What happened was the opposite. The messages coming from above were harsh, direct, and aligned with reality. This avoided the feeling of psychological betrayal that so many armies had experienced. In other wars, more than famous speeches, there was a clear line of communication down to the lowest level of the hierarchy. Orders made sense. Decisions were explained as much as possible. The soldier understood why he was being moved, why certain areas were prioritized, why some losses were inevitable. When you understand the reason, you accept the cost better. This reduces internal revolt, rumors, and insecurity, exactly the effects Germany hoped to provoke with the Blitz. Another crucial point was Churchill's own attitude towards danger. He didn't hide. He visited affected areas, appeared in public, and was seen walking among the rubble. For the soldier, this had an enormous impact, not because it solved the material problem, but because it showed consistency between words and actions. The leader didn't call for resistance while remaining distant from the risk. He positioned himself as part of the same collective effort. This creates a powerful psychological effect. The soldier begins to feel that he is not being used as a disposable part. He feels that he is part of something shared, where the cost is distributed more fairly. This feeling sustains morale much more than slogans. It sustains it because it is perceived, not announced. The Germans expected the Blitz to create internal political pressure, fissures between the government and the armed forces, and questions about the conduct of the war. But the clarity of the British leadership blocked this process from the outset. There was no room for fantasies that someone was hiding a secret exit or negotiating surrender behind their backs. The message was simple: the situation is serious. It will get worse before it gets better, and there is no easy alternative. Paradoxically, this is more reassuring than unrealistic promises. The soldier didn't need to expend emotional energy trying to guess what was really happening. This mental economy is crucial in extreme situations. It allows focus to remain on the immediate, following orders, protecting positions, keeping the unit functioning. Germany tried to generate psychological confusion. It found a system that reduced confusion to the bare minimum. Over time, this trust in leadership became almost automatic. Even when bad news arrived, it didn't cause disruptive shock. It was absorbed as part of an expected process. This doesn't eliminate fear or suffering, but it prevents collective emotional collapse. And it is precisely this collapse that Blitz needed to provoke in order to function. As the bombings continued and the command structure remained firm, the British soldier began to realize something important. If the government still spoke clearly, if the orders still made sense, if the leadership remained visible, then the enemy was not managing to break through the core of the resistance. This perception was not spoken aloud, but spread silently. And when this confidence takes hold, the psychological attack loses its power. Because fear may still exist, but it no longer controls decisions. Another element that sustained the morale of British soldiers during the Blitz was the concrete confidence that the country was not defenseless. It wasn't an abstract feeling nor blind faith. It was something they saw, heard, and perceived in their daily lives. The Royal Air Force. He was fighting, and he was really fighting. Every night that enemy bombers were intercepted, every morning that British fighters returned to the airfields, reinforced. A simple and powerful idea: the skies had not been surrendered. For the soldier on the ground, this carried enormous weight. The Blitz didn't happen in a vacuum. It was accompanied by news, reports, rumors confirmed by visible facts. British planes crisscrossing the sky, sirens ending, fires controlled, runways still operational. Even when losses were heavy, the signal was clear. There was a response. Germany didn't have complete freedom of action, and when the enemy doesn't dominate the skies, the feeling of psychological siege diminishes drastically. This point is crucial. Psychological warfare depends on the idea of powerlessness. If the soldier feels there is no way to react, fear grows unchecked. But when he realizes that someone is facing the attack, even at a high cost, the fear finds its limits. The British soldier didn't need to understand the technical details of the Battle of Britain. It was enough to know that attacks didn't go unchallenged. It was enough to realize that there was combat, not submission. Trust in the RAF also prevented a dangerous side effect, a feeling of abandonment. In many wars, ground troops suffer a moral collapse when they feel they have been left to their own devices, without air or strategic support. During the Blitz, this did not happen. Even under intense bombardment, there was a sense of coordination. The soldier felt he was part of a larger functioning system, albeit under pressure. Another important detail is that the RAF became a silent symbol of competence. It wasn't empty propaganda. The soldiers themselves heard direct accounts from pilots, saw damaged aircraft returning, and knew of real losses. This made the resistance more credible. There was no fantasy of clean war. There was real effort, ordinary people paying a high price to maintain control. This creates respect, and respect sustains morale more than speeches. Furthermore, the RAF helped shatter a central German expectation that the Blitz would produce a sense of inevitability. As long as British planes continued to take to the skies, the idea of automatic defeat did not take hold. The British soldier might be tired, frightened, exhausted, but he did not feel defeated. And that difference is everything. Psychological defeat begins when a person believes the outcome is already decided. The Blitz failed to impose that belief. Over time, this perception deepened. Even when attacks hit important targets, it became clear that Germany was paying a high price to maintain the campaign. Planes shot down, crews lost, operations becoming increasingly complex. To the British soldier, this sounded like a sign of attrition on the other side. It wasn't a cause for celebration. It was a practical observation. The enemy bleeds too. This balance of losses has a direct psychological effect. It prevents the construction of the image of an invincible adversary. Germany wanted to be seen as an overwhelming force, capable of breaking wills from afar. What the British soldiers saw was something different. A powerful enemy, yes, but limited, forced to persist because it had not been able to resolve the war quickly. This perception completely changes the mental state of those under attack. The continuous presence of the RAF also helped maintain discipline. When a soldier feels that the collective effort makes sense, he accepts hardships better. Sleeping little, living under constant alert, dealing with losses, all this becomes more bearable when there is a sense of progress, even if slow. The Blitz attempted to create psychological stagnation. Air resistance prevented this, and little by little something began to form in the minds of many soldiers. If Germany truly had the capacity to crush us, it would have done so already. The fact that we are still here, fighting, responding, indicates that this attack has limits. This idea doesn't emerge overnight. It seeps in slowly, night after night, as the pattern repeats itself. Bombardment, response, survival. Bombardment, response, survival. When this pattern takes hold, fear loses absolute control. It remains present, but no longer dominates decisions. And it is precisely at this point that psychological warfare begins to fail irreversibly. Because the soldier stops asking, when will this destroy us, and starts thinking, how long can they continue like this? This change in question seems small, but it alters the entire emotional balance. And from then on, Blitz was no longer playing alone. As the weeks passed, something began to quietly change in the minds of the British soldiers, the perception that the Blitz wasn't working as it should. This didn't come from official speeches or triumphalist announcements. It came from everyday, almost instinctive observation. The soldier saw the attacks continue, saw the destruction, but also saw that the promised effect simply didn't materialize. The country didn't stop. The units didn't disintegrate. The military routine continued, even under pressure. And when an enemy plan needs to be repeated without producing the expected result, it begins to lose psychological force. Initially, the Blitz was frightening. That's undeniable. The initial impact was heavy, especially during the first nights of intense bombing. But what Germany needed wasn't momentary fear. It was progressive collapse. And that collapse didn't come. The British soldier began to notice a pattern. Bad nights were followed by mornings of reorganization. Damaged barracks were transferred. Destroyed posts were replaced. Orders kept coming. Nothing indicated that the system was close to breaking down. This type of perception is devastating to any psychological strategy, because constant fear only works as long as the person believes it is leading to some inevitable outcome. When suffering repeats itself without producing results, it begins to lose its paralyzing effect. The soldier starts to think less about the immediate impact and more about accumulated resistance. He begins to understand that, however violent the attack may be, it has limits. Another important point is that the Blitz began to seem repetitive. Same tactics, same approximate times, same prioritized areas. This may seem like a technical detail, but psychologically it is enormous. The unexpected causes panic, the predictable causes tension, but also adaptation. The British soldier began to anticipate certain patterns. He knew when the risk increased, when it decreased. This did not eliminate the danger, but it restored a small sense of control, and control is the direct enemy of psychological terror. At the same time, an inevitable comparison arose. If Germany was truly in control, why did it need to insist so much? Why hadn't weeks of bombing produced the expected surrender? This question didn't need an official answer. It answered itself in practice. The Blitz was causing enormous damage, but it wasn't changing the essentials. The soldiers' morale remained strong, enough to keep the machine running. This perception did not generate euphoria. It generated something more dangerous for the enemy: cold trust. Not the confidence of someone who thinks everything is won, but the confidence of someone who realizes that the opponent is trapped in a strategy that doesn't deliver on its promises. The soldier began to see the Blitz less as a final verdict and more as a desperate effort to force a result that wouldn't come naturally. With this, the fear began to reorganize itself. It ceased to be a constant burden and became something manageable. The soldier no longer woke up thinking, "This will destroy us," but "This hasn't succeeded yet." This change is subtle but powerful. It transforms the victim into an observer. And when someone begins to observe the attack instead of just suffering from it, the psychological impact drops drastically. Furthermore, the continuation of the Blitz, without clear results, began to generate an even deeper interpretation. Perhaps Germany was betting everything on this card because it had no better one. This idea wasn't proclaimed, but felt. And when the soldier begins to suspect that the enemy is at the limit of its options, the emotional balance shifts. The pressure ceases to be one-sided. This understanding spread organically, conversation after conversation, day after day. There was no need for formal persuasion. Reality spoke for itself. The bombs kept falling, but the structure remained. And the longer this lasted, the more evident it became that the Blitz was turning into an expensive, exhausting, and increasingly ineffective endeavor. Ultimately, what began to emerge was a question that the Germans never wanted to provoke. If after all this they haven't broken us yet, what exactly do they hope to achieve now? This question doesn't bring immediate relief, but it brings something even more important: mental resilience. And when that resilience takes hold, it prepares the ground for the next stage of the war, where psychological attack no longer dominates the narrative, and the soldier begins to see not only what he is suffering, but also what the enemy is failing to achieve. Another factor that kept the morale of the British soldiers high was the deliberate maintenance of military routine, even when everything around seemed unstable. This didn't happen by chance. It was a conscious choice. During the Blitz, the worst thing that could happen was to allow military life to revolve solely around bombs, and that wasn't allowed. Training continued, schedules were maintained, inspections took place, orders were followed. To an outsider, it might seem like stubbornness. To those on the inside, it was psychological survival. The British soldier needed fixed points of reference, schedules, tasks, clear responsibilities. Amidst the chaos, routine acts as an axis. It prevents the mind from becoming trapped in fear alone. When you wake up knowing exactly what you need to do, even after a whole night of attacks, something inside you organizes itself. The Blitz wanted to break time, to transform each day into an endless extension of the previous night. Routine did the opposite. It divided the suffering into bearable blocks. This doesn't mean the soldiers ignored the danger. They knew the risk was real. But by maintaining normal activities, the army sent a silent and powerful message. War doesn't completely control us. We still control parts of our day. And that sense of control, even if limited, is vital for maintaining mental balance under constant pressure. Another important point is that the routine reinforced discipline without requiring extra effort. When everything follows a known pattern, behavior adjusts almost automatically. The soldier didn't need to constantly reflect on what was happening around him. He simply executed. This reduces emotional strain. Overthinking in extreme situations consumes energy. Acting within a known system saves that energy for when it's truly needed. Germany bet that the Blitz would disrupt the basic functioning of the armed forces. That fatigue would lead to delays, failures, and confusion. The opposite happened. The more external pressure there was, the more the system clung to its internal structures. Not out of blind rigidity, but out of necessity. Routine became a form of silent resistance. Furthermore, keeping the daily routine running created a sense of continuity. The soldier realized that despite everything, he was still moving forward in time. The days passed, the weeks accumulated. This is psychologically crucial. The Blitz attempted to create a feeling of stagnation, as if that suffering had no end. The routine showed that time was moving forward, and with it, the possibility of change. Another important effect was the partial normalization of risk. When certain tasks continue to be performed under bombardment, fear ceases to occupy the absolute center of attention. It doesn't disappear, but it shifts. The soldier learns to live with it without becoming paralyzed. This is not insensitivity, it is adaptation, and adaptation is one of the greatest enemies of psychological warfare. The routine also reinforced a sense of professionalism. The soldier didn't see himself merely as a victim of attacks, but as someone fulfilling a specific function within a larger effort. This strengthens identity. When you see yourself as an active part of something organized, the impact of external chaos diminishes. The Blitz attempted to reduce the individual to fear. The routine returned him to his function. Over time, this maintenance of daily routines began to produce a cumulative effect. Each day completed was concrete proof that the system still worked. Each task accomplished after a difficult night was a small, silent victory. These victories didn't make headlines, but they accumulated within the units. And the more they accumulated, the less room there was for the feeling of impending and collapse. Ultimately, the Blitz attempted to strip soldiers of their sense of normalcy. The army responded by preserving precisely that, albeit minimally and imperfectly. And in doing so, it created a psychological barrier that was difficult to overcome. Because when life goes on, even under attack, fear loses its ability to dominate everything. And this loss of control is an essential step towards something even stronger that was beginning to form among the soldiers. Something that didn't depend on orders or speeches, but on human bonds forged amidst the pressure. Another crucial element emerged precisely in this environment of constant pressure, the camaraderie among the soldiers and how they learned to separate personal fear from collective duty. These two things went hand in hand during the Blitz and reinforced each other, creating an emotional barrier that Germany never managed to overcome. When you live through consecutive nights under bombardment, sharing the same space, the same exhaustion, and the same risk, something changes in human relationships. The British soldier didn't face the Blitz alone in his own mind. He faced it alongside other men who were going through exactly the same thing. This creates a kind of bond that doesn't arise in normal times. It's not friendship in the common sense, it's practical trust. It's knowing that the other person will wake up, do their part, and not disappear when the pressure mounts. This bond had a direct effect on fear. Individual fear exists, but when it is shared, it loses its power. The soldier didn't need to feign courage all the time. It was enough to stick together. In many cases, simply seeing a comrade continue with the routine after a difficult night was enough to keep their own head in the right place. There were no elaborate motivational speeches. There were daily examples. And examples are harder to ignore than words. Camaraderie also prevented mental isolation, which is one of the main objectives of psychological warfare. Germany wanted each soldier to feel alone within the fear, questioning whether it was worth continuing. But this didn't happen easily when there was conversation, dry humor, simple comments amidst the tension. Often a short joke, made at the right moment, broke the mental sequence of panic. It didn't eliminate the danger, but it broke its emotional hold. At the same time, British soldiers developed something fundamental, the ability to compartmentalize fear. They didn't deny the fear, but they learned to place it in a specific place in their minds. Fear existed during the attack. Fear existed when hearing sirens. But outside of those moments, the focus was different. It was the immediate duty, the task of the day, the responsibility to the unit. This separation is not natural, it is learned under pressure. This skill was crucial because the Blitz was based on the exact opposite, that fear would seep into every aspect of the soldier's life, contaminating decisions, relationships, and discipline. What happened was that many learned to switch on and switch off emotionally as the situation demanded. This didn't make anyone insensitive, it made them functional. and functionality is the direct enemy of psychological collapse. Another important detail is that duty ceased to be something imposed from the outside and became something assumed internally. The soldier didn't move forward simply because there was a hierarchy. He moved forward because he didn't want to let down those who were by his side. This motivation is much more resilient than pure obedience. It's difficult to abandon a duty when you know it will directly affect people who trust you. Germany completely underestimated this human factor. It gambled that the individual would break under prolonged pressure. It failed to understand that within cohesive groups, pressure can have the opposite effect. Instead of fragmenting, it unites. Instead of isolating, it brings closer. Each night survived together reinforced this unity. Each following morning was a silent confirmation that no one had been left behind. Over time, this created a stable emotional pattern. The soldier no longer reacted merely as an individual under attack, but as part of a solid human structure. Fear remained present, but it was no longer the central focus of the experience. The focus shifted to commitment to unity, to the collective rhythm, to continuity. And when fear ceases to occupy the center, it loses its capacity to break morale. This balance between camaraderie and emotional control didn't appear overnight. It was built attack after attack, night after night. And the longer the Blitz lasted, the stronger this mechanism became. Germany believed that time would play in its favor. It didn't realize that in this case, time was training British soldiers to endure precisely what should have destroyed them. And it is precisely here that the story begins to take an important leap. Because when soldiers learn not only to resist fear, but to function despite it, psychological warfare ceases to be a central threat. It becomes just another element of the conflict. And from this point, something even more dangerous for the enemy begins to emerge. The clear perception that the attack not only failed to break morale, but ended up strengthening an internal structure that would now be much more difficult to shake. Another factor that helped prevent a breakdown in morale was the way in, which British soldiers began to observe what was happening outside their own country. This didn't stem from complex strategic analyses, but from fragmented information, conversations, indirect accounts, and news circulating within the units. Gradually, an inevitable comparison formed between what they were experiencing and what had happened to countries that had been occupied by Germany. This comparison had a very strong psychological effect. The British soldier didn't need heavy propaganda to understand the contrast. He knew that elsewhere in Europe, defeat meant something very concrete: total loss of autonomy, direct repression, imprisonment, disappearances, censorship, and everyday violence. It wasn't an ideological abstraction. It was something that was beginning to take real shape in conversations, in refugee accounts, in news reports crossing the channel. This created a clear mental line. The Blitz was terrible, but it was still resistance on one's own territory. There was still command, there was still choice, there was still a voice. The alternative, even if not spoken aloud, seemed far worse. And when the alternative is perceived as worse than the current suffering, a human being tends to endure more than they imagined they were capable of. This factor drastically reduced the space for deep discouragement. Not because the soldier was comfortable, but because he understood that retreating would not bring real relief. On the contrary, it would bring the loss of everything that still made sense to protect. This perception does not generate enthusiasm, but it does generate hard conviction, which is much more resilient than emotional motivation. Another important detail is that this silent comparison eliminated illusions. The British soldier didn't cling to the idea that maybe it wouldn't be so bad after all to lose. He had enough examples to know that it would be bad, very bad. This makes the mental decision simpler, not easy, but simple. Continuing to Resist ceased to be a matter of hope and became a matter of logic. Germany believed that the Blitz would present the British soldier with an emotional choice, to continue suffering or to seek a way out. But this way out, when observed more closely, did not seem like a way out at all. It seemed merely an exchange of known suffering for permanent and uncontrollable suffering. This interpretation neutralized one of the main expected effects of psychological warfare, the temptation of surrender as relief. Furthermore, this awareness strengthened the soldier's identity as a defender, not a victim. He saw himself not merely as someone enduring attacks, but as someone preventing something far worse from happening. This shift in perspective is subtle yet powerful. It transforms suffering into a function, and when suffering has a function, it ceases to be purely destructive. This understanding also spread informally within the units. It didn't need to be explained in speeches. A comment, a short news item, a comparison made in a low voice was enough. Gradually, a silent consensus formed. The Blitz was the price of maintaining control of one's own destiny. It wasn't a desired price, but it was an understood price. From then on, fear had a clear limit. It could be intense during attacks, but it didn't transform into existential doubt about the meaning of resistance. The soldier might fear death, but he didn't doubt the reason he was there. And when the reason remains firm, the psychological pressure loses some of its power. This factor is especially important because it operates in the long term. Bombings cause an immediate impact. Mental comparisons shape lasting decisions. Germany opted for quick and continuous shock. It failed to realize that the longer the Blitz lasted, the more time the soldiers had to observe, compare, and conclude that resistance was still the least destructive option. And it is at this point that morale ceases to be something fragile, dependent on the mood of the day, and becomes something structured, not based on exaggerated hope, but on a clear understanding of reality. The British soldier didn't need to believe that everything would end well soon. He only needed to believe that giving up would make everything definitively worse. When this conviction takes hold, psychological warfare reaches an almost insurmountable limit, because it stops fighting against volatile emotions and starts confronting rational, albeit harsh, decisions. And this completely changes the balance of the mental confrontation that the Blitz tried to win, and which, little by little, was slipping out of German control. Over time, the Blitz ceased to be seen merely as an air offensive and came to be understood by the British soldiers themselves as a clear sign that the German strategy had limits. This shift in perception was slow, almost imperceptible, but profoundly transformative. At first, each attack seemed part of something bigger, as if it were the beginning of an inevitable collapse. Months later, the feeling was different. The Blitz no longer seemed like the prelude to British defeat. It began to seem like proof that the enemy couldn't go any further. The soldier perceived this not through formal strategic analyses, but through the repetition of events. The bombs kept falling, but there was no invasion. There was no decisive breakthrough. There was no final blow that would justify such destruction. This created a silent question, one that no one needed to ask aloud. If this is the best they can do, then perhaps it is not enough. And this doubt, established on the German side, began to be reflected on the British side as restrained confidence. This perception had a powerful psychological effect. The Blitz had been planned to convey the idea of absolute force, total dominance, and inevitability. But the insistence without concrete results had the opposite effect. The soldier began to see the attack as a costly, repetitive and exhausting effort for the enemy. It was no longer just the British who were under pressure. The pressure began to seem shared. This completely changes the emotional dynamic. When you feel that only one side is suffering, the wear and tear accumulates unchecked. But when you realize that the other side is also paying a high price, resistance gains meaning. The British soldier didn't celebrate the destruction. He endured it. But upon realizing that Germany needed to continue, betting on the Blitz because it hadn't been able to resolve the war in any other way, something new emerged, the conviction that the enemy was not in total control of the situation. Another important point is that the Blitz began to lose its initial symbolic impact. The first few nights were shocking because they shattered expectations. Over time, expectations adjusted. The attack ceased to represent the absolute unknown and became something understood within a pattern. This didn't make it any less dangerous, but it made it less psychologically intimidating. The soldier knew what to expect, and when you know what to expect, fear ceases to rule alone. This adaptation had direct consequences on morale. The Blitz, which was supposed to weaken British confidence, ended up fueling an opposing narrative within the troops, that Germany was trapped in a strategy that did not deliver victory. This narrative was neither official nor organized. It was formed through daily experience, in the simple fact of waking up after another night of bombing and realizing that the country was still standing. With this, the Blitz began to be reinterpreted. Instead of proof of German strength, it came to be seen as a sign of frustration. Instead of a decisive instrument, it became a symbol of mutual attrition. For the British soldier, this was crucial, because if the enemy's maximum attack was not decisive, then there was room to resist, reorganize, and buy time. And buying time in a total war is buying life. This shift in perspective also affected emotional patience. The soldier stopped expecting an immediate collapse from either side and began to accept the war as something prolonged. This reduces anxiety. The Blitz aimed to create desperate urgency. It ended up creating patient resistance. And patience is a powerful weapon when the enemy is betting everything on a quick break. Gradually, the Blitz ceased to be the absolute center of the war experience. It remained present, it remained violent, but it no longer single-handedly defined the soldiers' mental state. They began to look beyond the air raid, to think about what would come next, to realize that this phase was not the entirety of the war. This ability to see beyond immediate suffering is a clear sign of psychological strengthening. And it is precisely at this point that the German strategy loses its last great advantage. Because when the attack ceases to dominate the enemy's internal narrative, it ceases to fulfill its main role. The Blitz was designed to break morale quickly. By prolonging itself unsuccessfully, it began to teach British soldiers to endure, adapt, and continue. What was supposed to crush ended up training them. When this awareness takes hold, morale ceases to be reactive and becomes structural. It no longer depends on good or bad news. It is sustained by the understanding that the worst has already been faced, and that even so, it was not enough to break the essential. And this silent realization prepared the ground for an even harsher conclusion for the enemy, that the Blitz not only failed to destroy British morale, but also helped consolidate a resistance that would now be much more difficult to shake in the next stages of the war. As this understanding deepened, the Blitz began to have an unexpected effect within the British forces. He began to reinforce the soldier's identity instead of weakening it. Not a heroic, poster-worthy identity, nor a noisy pride, but something more solid and discreet. The British soldier began to see himself as someone who had already been through the worst and was still functioning. This completely changes the relationship with fear. When you survive something that should have broken you, your internal frame of reference shifts. The fear doesn't disappear, but it ceases to be absolute. The soldier begins to think differently, almost without realizing it. Situations that once seemed unbearable are now seen as difficult, but manageable, and this has a powerful cumulative effect. Each night endured becomes experience. Each experience becomes practical confidence. Not confidence in the sense of quick victory, but confidence in one's own ability to continue. This process didn't happen through motivational speeches or exaggerated propaganda. It happened through repetition, through the simple realization that, despite everything, he was still there. He was still following orders. He was still keeping his head on straight. He was still part of a structure that hadn't collapsed. This builds something internal that can't be easily destroyed by further bombardment. Another crucial point is that the British soldier came to see himself as someone who had been tested. And when someone feels tested and approved, even without celebration, their attitude changes. The Blitz unintentionally created a generation of soldiers who had already faced direct terror and learned to live with it. This made them less vulnerable to future attempts at intimidation. The initial shock, which is the most powerful weapon in psychological warfare, had already been used. Furthermore, this feeling of reinforced identity was shared within the units. It wasn't something isolated and individual. It spread through small gestures, simple comments, and glances exchanged after difficult nights. There was a silent understanding that everyone there had gone through the same ordeal. This creates a sense of belonging that is very difficult to break. The soldier didn't just want to continue for himself, but to keep this collective identity intact. Germany gambled that the Blitz would leave permanent marks of emotional fragility. In many cases, it did leave marks, but not the kind that leads to surrender. It left marks that generated psychological hardening. Not cruel hardening, but functional hardening. The soldier learned to react without panicking, to assess risks more calmly, not to be dominated by the expectation of the worst. This is exactly the opposite of what the air campaign intended to produce. This internal strengthening also altered how the soldiers reacted to new threats. Every warning, every piece of bad news, every rumor passed through a different filter. There was no longer that feeling of, "this is unbearable." There was the recent memory of something equally terrible that had already been faced, and that memory functioned as an emotional anchor. Another important detail is that this process made morale less dependent on immediate external factors. It didn't fluctuate as much with good or bad news. It became more stable. And stable morale is extremely difficult to break because it doesn't overreact, either upwards or downwards. It holds its own. The Blitz needed emotional peaks of despair. It found an increasingly firm base. Gradually, the British soldier stopped seeing himself merely as someone resisting attacks and began to see himself as someone prepared for what might come next. This did not mean naive optimism. It meant mental readiness, a silent willingness to face new phases of the war with less shock and more control. And it is precisely here that the German mistake is fully revealed. In attempting to break morale, the Blitz ended up accelerating a process of profound psychological adaptation. It created soldiers more aware of their own limits, and more importantly, more aware that those limits had not yet been reached. When an army reaches this point, psychological warfare loses much of its power. This transformation was neither announced nor celebrated. It simply happened, and when it happened, it marked a point of no return, because a soldier who discovers he can endure what seemed impossible no longer reacts in the same way to future threats. The Blitz aimed to destroy the identity of the British soldier. It ended up helping to consolidate it. And this identity, now strengthened, would be carried forward into the next stages of the war, stages in which fear would no longer play the same dominant role. As a result, the Blitz came to be viewed by the British soldiers themselves in a completely different way than Germany had planned. What should have proven the enemy's absolute strength began to be interpreted as a sign of limitation. It wasn't a theoretical conclusion, nor the result of deep strategic analysis. It was a practical observation, built on the daily repetition of events. If the heaviest, most continuous, and most violent attack hadn't managed to break morale up to that point, then something essential was failing on the other side. This realization came slowly, almost uncomfortably at first. No one wanted to deceive themselves into thinking the danger had passed, but with time, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. The Blitz continued, but it didn't advance beyond what had already been seen. It didn't escalate to anything decisive. It didn't produce the promised collapse. To the British soldier, this began to sound like persistence, not dominance. And persistence in war usually indicates difficulty. This understanding directly affected expectations for the future. Initially, many feared that the Blitz was merely the first step towards something even worse, a preparation for invasion or a final blow. Months later, this expectation began to dissipate, not because the threat had disappeared, but because the signs did not point in that direction. The soldier began to realize that the enemy was expending enormous effort to maintain that level of attack, and even then, it could not subdue the country. This shift in expectations is crucial for morale. When you believe the worst is yet to come, fear projects itself forward and grows. When you begin to suspect the worst is over, even if the situation is still difficult, the psychological burden diminishes. The Blitz unintentionally pushed many soldiers toward this second interpretation, not one of relief, but of consolidated resistance. Another important effect was the shattering of the image of inevitability. Germany wanted each bomb to reinforce the idea that British defeat was only a matter of time. What ended up happening was the opposite. Each additional week of resistance showed that time was not exclusively on the attacker's side, and when time ceases to be the enemy's ally, the emotional balance is restored. This understanding also reduced chronic anxiety. The soldier no longer lived merely waiting for the next attack as if it were the decisive one. He began to view the Blitz as a prolonged, difficult, but not terminal phase. This completely alters how the mind deals with stress. The tension ceases to be explosive and becomes manageable, and manageable tension doesn't break armies. Furthermore, this more objective reading allowed the soldiers to recover something essential: perspective. They began to see the Blitz within a larger framework of the war, not as the whole. This opens up space for planning, patience, and strategic resistance. Germany needed the Blitz to be the absolute center of the British experience. When it ceased to occupy that place, it lost its main psychological function. Gradually, the idea of victory ceased to be something distant and abstract and began to be thought of in terms of possibility, not certainty, but viability. It was no longer, if we will fall, but when will this end? This shift in question is devastating for any aerial terror campaign because it indicates that fear no longer controls the mental horizon. In essence, the Blitz began to reveal something that British soldiers perhaps couldn't define in words, but clearly felt. Germany had no final blow in store. That was the coup. And if that coup hadn't been enough, then the logic of war began to reverse. The attack ceased to be a harbinger of defeat and became a test of resistance. This understanding did not bring euphoria. It brought relative calm. And calm, in war, is a powerful weapon. It allows one to endure, wait, and continue without being consumed from within. The Blitz aimed to provoke accelerated despair. It ended up producing patient resistance. And when a soldier reaches this mental state, he stops reacting impulsively and begins to operate with firmness. It is at this point that morale becomes something difficult to measure, but extremely solid. It no longer depends on the intensity of the attack, nor on the number of bombs dropped. It is sustained by the accumulated experience that the worst has already been faced, and it was not enough to break the essential. From then on, the Blitz no longer pushed British soldiers towards psychological defeat. It unintentionally pushed them towards the silent confidence that Germany had bet everything and had not achieved the result it needed. With all of this added up, the final effect of the Blitz on the morale of British soldiers ended up being exactly the opposite of what had been planned. Instead of destroying confidence, the attack helped solidify the certainty that Germany could not win that war through fear. This conviction didn't arise from enthusiasm or celebration. It emerged as something more solid and lasting, the realization that, even under the worst imaginable pressure, the essential had not broken. The soldiers didn't come to believe that victory would be easy or quick. They came to believe that defeat wasn't inevitable. And that difference changes everything. Because when a soldier stops feeling emotionally trapped, he recovers something fundamental, the ability to keep thinking, planning, and hoping. The Blitz aimed to shorten the psychological time of war, to force hasty decisions. It ended up lengthening the British mental capacity. Little by little, this certainty transformed into something shared within the armed forces. It wasn't openly discussed as a thesis, but it was present in behavior, in the way orders were carried out, in the absence of collective panic, in the discipline maintained even after bad nights. The soldier no longer reacted like someone on the verge of collapse, but like someone who had gone through an extreme test and learned to survive within it. This is a crucial point. The Blitz became a psychological landmark, a before and after. After the Blitz, future threats no longer carried the same emotional weight, not because they were smaller, but because the soldier's internal frame of reference had changed. He already knew from his own experience that it was possible to endure, much more than he imagined. This creates a foundation of confidence that doesn't depend on speeches or immediate victories. It depends only on the memory of having resisted. This psychological legacy stayed with British soldiers in the years that followed the war. They entered new phases of the conflict with a different attitude, more cautious, more realistic, but also firmer. They were not soldiers deluded by promises of glory. They were men who knew the cost of war and, precisely for that reason, were prepared to pay it without crumbling at the first shock. Germany gambled that aerial terror would create irreversible internal fissures. What it created was an identity of silent resistance. An identity based on the idea that if the worst had already been faced and the country was still standing, then the enemy did not possess the decisive psychological weapon it believed it had. This perception profoundly weakened any subsequent attempt at intimidation. Over time, the Blitz ceased to be remembered solely as a period of destruction and came to be remembered as a trial overcome, not romanticized, not celebrated, but recognized as a moment when something essential was tested and withstood. For the British soldier, this had enormous value, because it gave meaning to past suffering and placed the present within a line of continuity. We've been through this before, and we move on. Ultimately, the Blitz didn't break British morale because it attacked the wrong place. It tried to destroy emotions when resistance was already anchored in convictions, habits, structure, and experience. It tried to impose fear when fear had already been internalized and controlled. It tried to hasten surrender when the real effect was to slow down the psychological collapse. And this is the ultimate legacy of these months of bombing, the silent certainty that fear by itself would not win that war. The British soldier emerged from the Blitz not invulnerable, but aware of his own resilience. And when an army reaches that point, war ceases to be merely a contest of strength and becomes a contest of time, organization, and perseverance. That's where the Blitz definitively failed, because it taught British soldiers that the worst could be faced, and that even then it wasn't enough to break the essential bond. From that moment on, morale no longer depended on what the enemy did. It depended on what had already been proven in practice. And that's something no bomb can erase. What did you think of this story? Did it make you look at Blitz in a different way at any point? Leave a comment below. I read them all and want to know what resonated with you the most. When you comment, you help this content reach more people who also enjoy real, powerful, and well-told stories. If this video has captivated you this far, a like and a subscription make all the difference for the channel to continue bringing you stories like this, with depth and without romanticization. Stay tuned, because the next stories will delve even deeper into this pivotal period of history.